24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Singapore's news and information station.
This is CNA 938. Understand Asia.
Now, Weekend Life.
And coming up in this next hour, we start the first in our series of Singapore Retro, a program where we take a look at moments, at people, at places who make up our memories of Singapore. People who grew up in Singapore in the 50s and 60s, who perhaps started their businesses in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And today, we're going to be shining the spotlight on Kim Chu Kway Chang, started by Mrs. Lee Kim Chu, and have a conversation with her grandson, Edmund Wong, who will tell us more about how the business began and what it was like and what it continues to be like working in the business, opened and started by his grandmother. Singapore Retro coming up. The time is now 13 minutes after 12. Thank you for staying with us here on Weekend Life on CNA 938. And welcome into the Weekend Life with me, Susan Ng. This is Singapore Retro, the first in our series of programs where we take a look at life in Singapore. We take a walk down memory lane and we take a nostalgic look at the way things were in early Singapore. We look at places, at events, food, music that were popular in days gone by. Now, I'm a child of the 50s. I was born in the late 50s and I grew up in Singapore in the late 50s and 60s. And those times were, when I look back at them, quite fascinating for me. Now, whenever we talk about Singapore, whenever other people talk about Singapore, we always talk about food. Invariably, food comes to mind. You know, there are no shortage of hawker centers and food courts and eateries and restaurants to dine in. But people very often also talk about particular foods, a food item that was either very predominant in their childhood, things that their mums or dads introduced to them when they were young. Well, when I think about the old days, there is one particular food item that comes to mind, and this was something that my mum had introduced to me when I was quite young, and I love eating this until today. And this particular food item is also linked to a very iconic brand in Singapore. This brand name is Kim Chu Kway Chang. This is a family business that has survived 3 generations. I grew up eating the Nyonya dumpling, rice dumpling. Some of you may also have grown up eating this Nyonya rice dumpling. My uncle's house was just around the corner at Koon Seng Road from Mrs. Lee's old shop at Joo Chiat Road. Well, her sons have taken over the business. They want to continue Grandma's legacy. I had the opportunity to visit with the grandson, Edmund Wong, and Edmund is very much involved in the business. He speaks about his grandmother and the business with great passion. Edmund is CSR director of Kim Chu Kway Chang, and he took time off from a very busy rice dumpling festival period that was just a few days ago to talk with me. Here's Edmund.
My grandma started the business out of poverty. There was a need for her to bring up a family. And the only skill she had back then was cooking, culinary skills that were taught to her by her maternal side grandma. She was a great cook. She learned all the cooking from her, making kueh kuehs, rice dumplings. But there was only one particular item that she brought out as a brand to make a living, and that would be the Nyonya rice dumplings. So my grandma first started selling rice dumplings and what we call zap chai peng today under a banyan tree at the cross junction of Everett Road and Joo Chiat Place. Well, that tree is no longer there, but ever since we've gained independence, the first batch of PAP leaders, Dr. Fong, helped my grandma to acquire or maybe perhaps get a bank loan. So she got a bank loan to service a unit, a shop house along Joo Chiat Place. And she's been there since 1945, I mean before the wartime, around Katong and Joo Chiat. From then, rice dumplings brought up her family. People know her for Nyonya Rice Dumplings. And eventually, when my parents took over the business from my grandma, they expanded in terms of coming up with different varieties of rice dumplings. It was only much later, I guess, around in the late or maybe mid-90s, my mom came up with an ingenious idea to start to sell a mini Nyonya rice dumplings, so mini bite-sized rice dumplings. The idea was that for her to cater to the younger folks, the younger generation, and also aging society. You cannot eat so much also. So that's how she first came up with the idea. You don't waste food, eat only what you require, and that's how the mini rice dumplings came to be. And then when it came up to us, we are third generation business owners now. We brought our own interest into the business, and it is what it is today, very much like a heritage business. So it's no longer just a food business. We see ourselves as a heritage business. We see ourselves also as custodians of the Peranakan culture to amplify a greater appreciation of this culture, and hopefully more of our foreign friends, Singaporeans will come to appreciate what makes the foundation of this multicultural community in Singapore so special.
When you say we, who do you mean?
Well, we encompass my family. I'm not the only person running the family. I have two other elder brothers. I have a younger sister. Before we all came back to the family business, we were doing our own thing. My eldest brother, he was a trained accountant. He's right now a fashion designer. My second brother was an English teacher in Japan. He's now helping with the family business in terms of operations. I used to be a programmer, and I used to serve under MCYS. But now I'm back in the family business too. And then my younger sister, she's not quite back yet, mainly because we all came back during a point of crisis. Once upon a time, there was the swine flu and there was the bird flu. And then because Nyonya rice dumplings, in its most traditional way of producing it, use pork. So with the swine flu, people were afraid to eat pork for a moment. So my parents innovated. They came up with ideas to make chicken rice dumplings, vegetarian rice dumplings, and from there the business sustained itself, struggling. Then my brother came back because there was a need for additional help within the family to ensure that the business survives. So after that, there was also the manpower crisis. The biggest hit was actually during, I believe, 2008, around there. And when I officially truly came back to the family, that was 2009. There was a manpower crunch. My family was struggling in terms of we couldn't systemize everything to have a streamlined flow of a delivery chain, or maybe perhaps to systemize certain areas of our operations. And because of the lack of manpower, production has also been affected in some ways. So I had no choice. I couldn't pursue the things that I want to do. I came back to the family business, and because as a programmer, I program things and I help to operate things in ways that I felt best could help the family.
And that's Edmund Wong, grandson of Mrs. Lee Kim Choo. Now here's the question for Edmund. If the crisis hadn't happened, would Edmund have come back to join the family business? We'll find out right after this. Welcome back into Singapore Retro on Weekend Live. I'm Susan Ng. Now, if the crisis hadn't happened, would Edmund Wong have rejoined the family business? They all had interests outside of the business, and this was a question that I had posed to Edmund.
Since you all came back into the business, you also mentioned you brought your own interest into the business.
Right.
And you came back during a time of crisis. If the crisis hadn't happened, do you think you would be running this business?
I believe that if the crisis hadn't happened, my parents wouldn't, or maybe perhaps my family wouldn't feel the stress to be able to say it's impossible or very challenging for them to hire someone to help them with certain areas. And because of that, if that hadn't happened, I believe I would be enjoying myself working in the civil service, or maybe perhaps doing things that I like, or maybe things that I pursue and I think I would really truly want to pursue. But I guess that also opens up a new channel of opportunities for me. I realized that there is no one way, or maybe a path that would allow ourselves to feel fulfilled. So example, my initial idea was that if I would have myself attached to a civil service industry, I would be able to help craft policy, help the community, and this and that. I had seen myself doing this back when I was much younger. And then I see we could actually bring our passion into a business. Like example, I came back to the family business. We were just a F&B establishment. But within our own sphere of influence, we see ourselves having to be able to reach out to various community groups. And through the works that we do, we can rightfully also touch or change lives. So I guess when one door closes, another opens, and we seek opportunities and see how best we can work around it.
So you've been back in the business 9 years now.
Yes,
You speak about it with great passion.
we try to.
Have you developed a love for the business? I know you love to do other things, and you mentioned you have other interests,
Right.
but you're toiling day and night, and we're into the rice dumpling festival,
Dumplings,
and
yeah,
you're
that's right.
working 24/7, trying to get dumplings out for people who order and for people to walk by to purchase. Have you developed a real interest now, a real
I
passion
guess
for the business?
I wouldn't say that there would be a point in time that this happened. If I could share a story with you, when perhaps this also relates to my brothers. When we were much younger, we were told by our parents, don't come to the factory, don't learn to wrap rice dumplings, it's very hard work, don't learn. But we were so mischievous and we wanted to learn because we see our parents make them all the time, and eventually when we, in our own way, mastered it without having real proper teacher teaching us, but we learned through observation and attempted to do so. There was a moment in time during our teens where, because our parents knew that we know how to wrap, they would say, come back and help to wrap, quick, come on and wrap. So there was a moment in time where we were curious. And there was another moment in time where we were very, perhaps, reluctant. And there was a moment in time again where we felt there was a need to come back. And that's when we felt that the responsibility is important for us to come back, to be able to see that we bring our own, perhaps, expertise and bring the knowledge that we have gathered outside to see how best can we help advance the family business forward. That's right.
So you not just do the programming and the
No.
operations, you actually sit in the kitchen and wrap rice
Everything.
dumplings.
It's only a title. Maybe I call myself a CSR director, but the reason why I had to give myself a title as that is so that people outside can relate and say, oh, they actually do CSR. They can engage us to do certain things. So our purpose of having to maintain a CSR in our business is not so much about charity. We have a cause, and the cause to ensure that our Peranakan culture will be better appreciated and acknowledged by a lot more people. A lot of times people don't know what it means to be Peranakan. And what we do as part of our CSR is to let, or perhaps allow more of us to realize that this culture does not exclusively belong to people whom are known as Peranakans. This culture belongs to all of us. Right?
This is a Singaporean culture
Exactly.
after all. Although it does extend a little bit beyond our shores, we need to embrace everyone. We're going to go back to your grandmother now.
Right.
She started her business under the banyan tree in a time of great need
Right.
for her family. She had to provide for her children.
That's right.
She had to put food on the table.
Mhm.
She did the one thing she knew best,
Right.
and that's to cook. And that's how most heritage F&B businesses started anyway.
Right.
The guy who knew it best, the lady who knew it best, you just get stuff on the table, and if you can sell that, then that's great.
Right.
She started off selling chaipum, as you call it. Economy rice is what
Yes,
we
that's
call
right.
it now.
Right.
But she also made these fabulous rice dumplings that Rumah Kim Chu or Kim Chu Kway Chang is now famous for.
Right.
This was her own home specialty at that time.
Right. So I think it's important, and I think we feel very proud that when the name Kim Chu comes to mind, synonymously people think of rice dumplings. But what we hope people will remember is that our brand is not only Kim Chu. We are Kim Chu Kway Chang, and Peranakans are proud the way we call the name, mainly because Kim Chu is my grandma's name. Kway Chang is the Peranakan way of saying rice dumplings.
Yes.
And we don't call it bachang or whatever, we call it Kway Chang. Peranakans call it Kway Chang. I think my grandma has a way in her own expertise in her own culinary journey to only master this Nonya Chang. So she's only been doing this one item. And I believe because of that, over the years people remember that flavor and it became what is known as a heritage item. Right.
When did she then diversify to do other things?
I guess you would see, because it was a moment in time for her that she was struggling. She had to bring in as much of whatever she could find to sell or to offer a service to be able to provide food for the family. Diversifying like various new products wasn't in her frame of mind to be able to pursue during her time. It was only my parents, when my parents came into the business, that they decided now we are in the family business, we can do various things. There's more hands. And then I guess in the same way for us with our parents, we came into the pictures, we also brought in our own expertise and it expanded to what it is today.
So you're the third generation owners, so to speak.
In terms of family heritage, we are 7th generation Chinese. But in terms of family business, yes, we are the 3rd generation.
And so as Edmund and his family continued to run this 3rd generation business, I had Edmund share with me memories of Grandma, Mrs. Lee Kim Chu, and we'll hear those memories right after we bring you the news. And I invite you to stay with me on Singapore Retro on Weekend Live on the all-new CNA 938. And I'm Susan Ng. Welcome into Singapore Retro on Weekend Life here on the all-new CNA 938. Today we are visiting with an iconic Singapore brand, Kim Chu Kway Chang, started in 1945 by Mrs. Lee Kim Chu, a business that started under a banyan tree. Mrs. Lee, during that time, sold food to support her family. She started off by selling what we know today as economy rice, and then decided to put kway chang, as the Peranakans call it, or rice dumplings as we also know it, on the menu. And she was encouraged to do this by her relatives, who said that her rice dumplings were really very good. So she put what she knew on the table to make ends meet for her family. And we heard her story and the family's story via her grandson, Edmund Wong, who is the company's CSR director. And Edmund and her brothers have gone back to the family business, and together with their parents are taking Kim Chu Kway Chang into perhaps the next chapter of their business.
How true are you to your grandmother's original idea and philosophy even of starting this business? How much of Mrs. Lee Kim Chu do you have in this business?
Everything that she has taught us, everything that we've known of her has become like a how shall I say, philosophy in how we craft our food art, Nonya rice dumplings perhaps. In terms of how we produce them, has always remained the same, but in terms of how we prepare them, could be different. So maybe I could share something in the light of how it is done today. Now back in those days, my grandma, because to simplify everything, she used charcoal to cook her meat and everything. She cannot stop charcoal from burning. So it is only appropriate for her to use charcoal and to cook the meat, and if there's heat still boiling, she would still continue to cook if there's additional meat. So to ensure that the cooked meat can be preserved and to be used over a period of time, for her back then she would cook like maybe a pot of meat, and she would use to wrap rice dumplings daily. There weren't refrigeration or freezers back in those days. So she would keep them in a huge pot, and in the huge pot, when you cook meat, there will be oil. The oil became more like natural preservative where it seals the meat. Now, in that process, we are still maintaining that. And what we realized having to have done that, it's not that it helps to preserve it, but it helps to flavor or enhance, when you simmer or when you put good piece of chunk of meat in seasoned, what we call rempah. Peranakans call it spices, rempah. It becomes flavorful. So we still maintain it the traditional way of maintaining or preparing the meat. Through observation, we realized that this is still the best way to preserve tradition. How do we prepare the rice? Now, my grandma used to soak it in water. What we do now, as the next generation of business owner, is that we take in new practices from other places. My brother used to study and work in Japan for a moment. He observed the Japanese preparing sushi rice, and the Japanese takes rice very seriously. And so, from his observation and his knowledge with rice, we realized that there's a special way. I don't think we should share it here, but there's a special way of preparing the rice to ensure that the quality of rice is not compromised, but enhances the chewiness. But there's a way in which we can do that, and we adapt. We brought in Japanese techniques of preparing the rice, but the taste is still very traditionally Grandma Kim Chu's. Yes.
So tradition and technology, that's the one way to take the business forward.
I would say that technology helps to lighten the production, but we should not compromise efficiency for quality. I think once we do that, I think we don't want just to be a company that looks into production and rely technology to help us into production that it compromises with our quality of rice dumplings.
So obviously the traditional taste
Yes.
still matters very much.
Very much, very much.
Do you still think of grandma every time you take a bite into a
Perhaps,
dumpling?
ironically, I would say it's not just the rice dumplings, but I always remember my grandma's sharing this story with me, and that's how we take the kueh, the customs of eating kueh very seriously. Peranakans call kueh, and kueh is actually a Chinese customs and tradition. There's this one particular kueh that my grandma used to share with me. I've always remembered it since I was very young. A kueh lapis. You know, we peel it layer by layer. She would tell me the significance and the importance of eating kuehs. She would tell me like her hardships. She'd been through so many hardships until she'd seen my parents took over the business, and there were happy moments and there were hardships. She told me, because once upon a time when I was much more mischievous, I would just chew the kueh without peeling it. She said, no, eat slowly, savor every moment as it is. The brighter colors would represent success, happy moments. There could be dull colors that would represent failures and sad moments in life. But when you piece the good and bad memories together, you should rightfully see that beautiful rainbow at the end of your journey.
Wow, I like that so much.
So my grandma used to share this a lot with us, and I remember it very much. And if there's anything really, it's about the kueh lapis story. My grandma had been through very difficult times, and she had never once complained. But of course, she bared frustrations, and we've seen that when we were in the shop. And my parents got the biggest blast. It was very challenging times for them. I hope that we could really pass on Grandma Kim Chu's legacy to allow more of our visitors, Singaporeans, to know that kueh, the things that we do here in Kim Chu Kueh Chang, really it's not so much about just preserving our family's legacy, but it's about preserving what we have in Singapore, our shared culture.
And you know what? Sitting there in Rumah Kim Chu one sultry afternoon and hearing Edmund share the kueh lapis story, I could almost feel Mrs. Lee Kim Chu standing there with us. My continuing conversation with Edmund Wong in a moment. Stay with us on Singapore Retro.
As you're talking about Grandma Kim Chu and sharing the story of the kueh lapis,
Right.
you're crying.
I'm not sure, this might be
Yeah.
serious, right?
I think it's great that you still have Grandma Kim Chu in the front and not way in the back. That for you and your parents and your
Right.
brothers and your sister,
Right.
that this isn't just a business. This is a legacy
Right.
that you want to, and I do hope that you will, be able to continue even into the next 10, 15, 20 years.
We want to try our very best to achieve this, and a family culture like this, I think if it's anything that could be done to amplify this, the appreciation of a shared culture, I think more of us, not only just family members, we want to bring in more people to ensure that this culture survives.
Your parents are still very actively involved in
They
the
call themselves
business.
half retired, but they are still very much active. My father had never once left the shop. We only rest once a year during the first day of the Chinese New Year. And if my father were to take just that one day of rest, he will get sick, he has the flu, he has a cough, and he cannot rest at all.
But that is amazing. And I think that is the resilience of a family. It is the relationship that families have, for example, your family, in order to keep this business going. It's to keep the memory alive, so to speak, but it's also to keep the legacy of Grandma Kim Chu alive.
Right.
What do you see as the future of Kim Chu Kueh Chang?
We still see this business as a business that we want to maintain, not to expand too quickly. We want to maintain it as a family business, as a heritage business now. And in times you realize that people come to Singapore, or maybe perhaps if you allow me to give you an example, if we visit a foreign island or foreign country, there's this one thing that we have to find. That is part of culture. If our business becomes very easily accessible and becomes very easily visible everywhere, we find that perhaps we might not do justice for our grandma. We want people to find us. We want people to be able to discover Katong and Juche. We want people to say, hey, you can only, the best way for you to get the best item is to journey to a certain area. If it becomes too commercialized, we worry that we will compromise in the quality of our rice dumplings, and we don't want to do that anytime soon. Right.
You also spoke to me when we chatted on the phone
Right.
that your grandmother had shared with you some foods that no longer survive, well, that are no longer to be found today. You still have these in your memory?
My father and mother used to share this with me because they used to what we call pak tor. And then they would say, you know, my father is a very filial son. He works 24/7 in a shop. But now and then when my father was with my mom and they had to go out for pak tor session, my dad would casually buy this drink. It's a very special drink. It's not like chendol, but he used to buy them at the back alley of the shop. And there's this uncle who would come with a small little trishaw. And in the trishaw, my father used to tell me that there are tins and there is a block of ice. And then they'll shave the ice. I really couldn't really describe how it is like, but it was that item that my father dedicated himself to buy for my mom every time they see each other. And so I thought maybe that's something. He said it's not chendol. I asked him, was it chendol? He said, no, it's not chendol. There's gula melaka inside. There is there's no green color thing, and that's the chendol.
Yeah.
There's none of that. But there's ice, shredded ice, and that was something. There were times when my father, because they stayed in this shared apartment, it's a very old shop house, where you find 10 families living in that small little area at the corner of the house, shop house. And they used to stay on the second level. And every time, like example, a rickshaw uncle comes by with maybe like the chao kway teow, my father used to shout, hey, like one packet of chao kway teow please. And they would, you know, with the levy, pull the chao kway teow up and
I remember that.
yeah. You don't really need to go downstairs to get the food. Everything is so casually done. It's like the fast food of that time, you know, the convenient food. During major festive seasons like Chinese New Year, Hari Raya, Diwali, Easter, we share a common food item. And this item would be the pineapple tart. How would we get to enjoy the pineapple tart through various races in Singapore? Pineapple came to us from a different part of the world. The concept of eating kueh came to us from our Chinese forefathers. Kueh is a Chinese dialect, all right? But the concept of baking pastries, the soft pastries, came to us from our European friends. So what it is really was that our ancestors, our forefathers, pieced together, they marry cultures through the culinary journey, like pineapple from South America, tarts from European regions, the concept, the auspicious element of having to eat or to hold a pineapple, because pineapple is called ong lai, it sounds like wang lai, which means the hope for prosperity. But there is another name we call ong lai, we call it feng li. And the Chinese, when they first saw the fruit, they were immediately attracted to it because it reminded them about the body of the phoenix and the tail of the phoenix. But after having to eat it over generations, they realized the flesh is yellow and they call it wang li, ong lai. So to cut the long story short, really, our Chinese forefathers first invented the dish by marrying the ideas together. They shared it with their local indigenous friends, their European friends, and over generations, we get to enjoy pineapple tarts during major festive season. And this really tells of our shared identity. Being Peranakan is not about a particular race. Being Peranakan, it is very much about the marriage of cultures more than it is about the marriage of races.
So the pineapple tarts hold a special place in your heart because you guys now also bake and sell pineapple tarts.
My grandma has a lot of recipes. She inherited this recipe book from her grandma as well. So we have this book of recipes all written in words that we couldn't read at times, but were translated properly. We attempted to try the recipes and we decided to bring them out to sell.
And how true are you to the recipes of grandma?
We try our very best. When my grandma was still around, she would taste them for us. And to tell you the truth, during the recent years, about maybe 10 or maybe 15 years ago, when her mind isn't as sound, when she tries the pineapple tarts, like when we made them, she will remember her own grandma. So when that happens, we know that we've done something right. So we always let grandma try the recipes before we attempted to sell them. So whatever that's on shelf right now, my grandma had tested all of them.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Food brings back so many memories for so many people, and they are part of our Singapore culture. And we will, in the weeks to come, discover the history of places that to us are heritage areas. We take walks down memory lanes. And we're also going to talk about food. How can we not talk about food? We'll also discover some food delivery options that existed in those days, in the 40s, 50s and 60s. Quite exciting food delivery options. You know, the days of the street hawkers, and when you were to let your basket down if you lived on a second or third level of a block of apartments, and let the basket down and the hawker would put the food in there. You put the money and then the food will come up. These are memories. These would be our retro look at life in Singapore as we take our walks down memory lane. So more memories to come in the weeks to come. And I want to thank today Edmund Wong, who is CSR Director of Kim Chu Kway Chang, for joining me on the first edition of Singapore Retro to share memories of his grandmother, Mrs. Lee Kim Chu. And, you know, I hope that you, like me, have found the information that he shared with us, the stories that Edmund shared with us about his grandma, fascinating days where you could set up stall right under the banyan tree and make ends meet. I'm Susan Ng. This has been Singapore Retro on Weekend Life on the all-new CNA 938. Thank you for joining me.